Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm talking to Jerry Wheeler about Mercedes General. Welcome, Jerry.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
I am so happy you're here because I told Jerry before we started recording, he made me a mess because these stories are so heartfelt and so touching, and it was just amazing. And Jerry also told me before we started recording that all of these stories are fiction. So I will say that you have done the best autobiography that's fiction that I think I've ever read.
Wow, thank you. I really appreciate that.
So what made you come up with this particular idea of telling these two boys' stories?
Well, as I say in the introduction or the acknowledgments or whatever you want to call them, my late partner had just passed away, and he was Jewish. So there's always a ceremony. I mean, you can't have the headstone for a year until you unveil the headstone at a separate ceremony. So we had gone through a year of grief, and when we had that ceremony, the Rabbi Foster, kept saying something about how how our lives were shaped by the deaths that we experience. And even though I was in the midst of some grief, my writer's ears kind of like, what was that again?
I love it.
And that's what started the whole thing. And I wanted to make it a grand kind of sweeping epic. It was supposed to be a bunch of flashbacks, with each flashback being a death. And it was surrounded by this frame story. But the problem was that I never could find a frame story that I liked. It didn't sound contrived, and that worked. So I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it for like 20 years.
Oh, wow.
These stories go back. The first one goes back at least 21 years.
Right.
So by the time I was done and I was finished with the book, which I hated, by the way.
Okay. All right.
I hated it. When I was finished with it, I just put it away. I'm like, we'll never speak of this again. But the more I started, and then I went on to write Pangs, did a couple of short things, and then I'm looking around for another project, and I'm seeing all of the work that I had put into these flashbacks, and I said, I'm not sure. I think they may tell a story all by themselves. So I sent them all to my publisher, Sven Davison at Rebel Satori Press. And I said, I have no hope of any objectivity about these at this point. So would you please read them and see if we have a book here? And Sven liked them. At that point, he was more enthusiastic about the project than I was, to tell you the truth. And then finally, he's like, well, this is great. He's like, the problem is that we need probably 40,000 more words to make it a book.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, fine. So that's when I wrote the last two stories, Mercedes General and Another Death, Another Path, Another Death. So, and then by that time, those two stories enabled me to get back my love of the other six. So, and then on, it became a wonderful project for me.
Oh, good. I think, when you work on something for a long time and you come to what you feel like is a bit of an impasse, I think it becomes frustrating if you can't see your way forward. So what you've mostly done here, I would say, is we've got almost a straight lineal story from when the boys are young. The boys are Spencer and Kent. and they meet when they're very young, and then they have an entire life together, which I found to be so beautiful because it's sort of, I would say they each found their Prince Charming or their soulmate early on. And that's
Hmm.
not something we really read about so often. Most of the time in what I might call love stories, we have the classic rom-com, which this isn't at all. This is simply the lives of two wonderful boys who spend a lifetime together. Now I'm probably going to cry soon. So, because I'm telling you, this really got to me, Jerry, in so many ways, because I think we all hope in life, or most people hope in life, that they find their soulmate or the person they love. It doesn't always happen, but you've given us two boys to root for, and they are worth rooting for.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That's a lovely thing to say.
Oh, it's so heartfelt. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the stories, just a little bit, because I
Mhm.
think what I felt like, as I said, I'd ask you before we recorded if this was autobiographical, and it's complete fiction. But I think that each story in this book touches on some aspect that an LGBTQ plus person has experienced or we've seen on television. And because I think it's important to say it doesn't always have to happen to me, but it's something that I think we all recognize.
Mhm.
And I'm specifically thinking about the prom. So
Oh,
one of
okay.
so Spencer says he wants to go to the prom because he feels like they should experience the same thing that all of their classmates experience. Did you
Mhm.
go to? I didn't go to any prom because I wasn't out and I didn't have a boyfriend, and I didn't want to go with a girl because I felt there was so much pressure. If you take a girl to the prom, that you're supposed to be interested in her. Did you go to any of your proms?
No, I did not. Um, High school for me was something to be endured and then left behind. Right? I even struggled. This of course is going to be my 50th anniversary. And one of the very few people that I still talk to from that time period, he's trying to convince me to go to the reunion. And I can't see the sense to it because, I already speak to the people that I want to speak with. Everybody else, it's marginally interesting to see how everybody's aged, but I that's a long way to travel for that kind of novelty. You know?
I
Can't
hear
I just see him on Facebook?
right. Yeah, because some of them, it's like, I don't even really want to see you on Facebook, but I was nice enough to say yes. But I will say that there's a bit of power, or at least it was for me. So I didn't go to my 10th, but I went to my 20th and my 30th. And
Wow.
the power was that I wasn't timid anymore. And if you wanted to come at me in a bully state, which I experienced throughout my entire high school career, if you wanted to come at me as a bully, I can meet you there now. Bring it on. And for
Right.
me, that turned out to be very powerful. I did not have to do that, thankfully. I think that the majority of people had grown up and realized that they had to fit in the world. Hopefully, that was their reasoning
Right.
anyway. I did sit at my 30th one, though. I did sit next to my biggest tormentor in high school, who's now a minister, and I managed to pat his leg off and on the entire night. And I just knew it would drive him insane. And I was like, see, you shouldn't have turned me into what you tried to be. So
That's very fitting. And see, if I had intended on some kind of revenge, that would have been a good motivation to go right with you.
it is a wonderful motivation. So in this story, I do remember when same-sex couples first started going to proms, not reunions, but
Mhm.
proms, and how very um, divided communities were. And I felt like you gave us that in spades, Jerry. I felt like you captured all of the emotions that both Spencer and Kent were going through, plus the emotions of the people who were against them. And I think that must be difficult. Was it hard to write, or was it lethargic to write?
No, that one wasn't difficult to write at all. I think the toughest challenge I had in that particular one was trying to figure out who was going to die, because it wasn't going to be any of the main characters.
Right,
So
right.
it would had to have been somebody ancillary, and I would try to figure out what would be um, the most impactful, and that's how I chose somebody that was in the crowd. I don't want to give it if I
No, no,
make a
no. Well,
spoiler there.
no, and it because it's not worth it. But I will say that the choice of the character who dies in this chapter was impactful, and it was to show. I am assuming I'm going to put words in your mouth. I guess it was to really show there are consequences all the way around, and I
Right,
don't mean I
right.
don't. I mean, of course, it affects our two protagonists, but it's not their fault. But there are, sometimes in life, consequences do bite us in the ass when we least expect it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're right. That was a big motivation of mine for that ending.
It was. If I could use the word delicious, I'm going to use it. It really was very impactful. I think is definitely the word. So tell us who Miss Lee is.
Miss Lee is a composite um, of a couple of different people. She kind of looks like my grandmother, and she behaves like a wonderful lesbian lady that my mother was a friend of my mother's when I was growing up. And it was interesting because we never talked about the fact that she was a lesbian, but um, that was always there, that was always present. And I also needed somebody that had money. Because as much as these guys go through, um, they are white and they are privileged
Yes.
because they both come from money. But and the way that I kind of got around that mentally, or mentally myself, was the fact that they do things with their money that are for good. I mean, they take care of their own,
Yes. Yes. And
which
that's
is something that I think maybe we've not forgotten, but we've forgotten that we do take care of our own, and we need to reinforce that.
absolutely, Jerry. Absolutely. And that is yet another thing in this book that we see. These two guys are loving with each other, but they're loving with both their family and their found family. I
Hmm.
mean, Miss Lee is Kent's grandmother, and she's that person everybody needs in their life. She
Right.
is a take no prisoners, shoot first, ask questions later type person, and I love that.
Yes.
And I will say that I've known more than one person who either had a shotgun or a pistol under the seat in their car. So I was like, all right, I get you, Miss Lee.
Or by her rifle, by the rocking chair, definitely.
Precisely, precisely. And it wasn't for evil. It was because she was going to protect the people she loved, including herself. And I
That's
was like,
right.
I love that. I love that.
And she wouldn't use it just on its own merits. She would just, it's just there for backup,
That's
just
right,
in case.
just in case. So two cars figure into this, both the Mercedes and the Eldorado. And
Yeah.
so have you had a favorite car, or was there a car moment in your life that sort of stood out? I mean, I find that when authors typically when they create a secondary character that's an inanimate object like an automobile, somewhere along the line, something was sort of tugging at their heart. So, did you have a favorite Eldorado or a favorite Mercedes?
No, I'm not a car person at all,
Okay.
as a matter of fact.
All
Um,
right.
the thing with the Mercedes was that I needed a term for the hospice that they ran. And again, not to provide any spoilers, but just for the people out there, my protagonists kind of like back into beginning an AIDS hospice during the start of the pandemic, or not the pandemic, the epidemic.
Right.
Um, And once, and I needed a way to refer to it. So, I noticed that both of the times that I had Spence pick one of the hospice boys up, he was always driving around in the red Mercedes, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's got to be it. And the reason that that became the title is, I don't know if you read the acknowledgments, but the when I started the thing, and it was a novel with a frame story. It was called The Dead Book.
Okay.
And when I finished it, and I went to Matt Bright at Ink Spiral Designs for the cover. Little plug there for
Yes.
Matt. He came back with all kinds of wonderful covers for the Dead Book, but none of them really said anything what the book was about. So I'm thinking to myself, well, this is garbage out, garbage in, because Matt knows what he's doing. He does all of my covers. So the thing is, I have to change the title. And the only thing that I could think about was the title of the second to the last, the now title story, Mercedes General. And I'm like, that has to be it. That has to be my title. And from then on, we were able to work on a cover.
I love that. I love that. And there's a sign on the front from the hospice, and it says, "Please let us die in peace." And that
Hmm.
story was just, oh, I was a mess. I mean, a bad mess on that one because because there was a time in history where, just as we were talking about the prom earlier, there have been so many times in history where not in our neighborhood,
Hmm.
and
Right.
even in cities like Los Angeles and New York, where the epidemic was raging, and there was a lot more knowledge in those two cities than there were in Iowa, but we still had people in Los Angeles and New York still saying, "Not in my neighborhood."
Right.
And
Right.
when you begin to take the humanity out of life and only look at it in black and white terms, then we really do lose as a society, because humanity is so important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I really wanted to cover that period of time. I mean, you can't write a history of a gay couple in 40 years from that time span without encountering that, the epidemic. And so I knew at some point that if I was going to publish this, that I would have to write about the epidemic, but I didn't want to do so um, in a way that wasn't, how do I say this, that was positive. I mean,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
whole experience with AIDS, of course, is a negative experience,
Sure.
but you can deal with it in a more positive way. I mean, these
That's right.
guys, yes, they are white, they do have privilege, they do have money, but they take that money and they try to do something for the community with it.
That's right. That's
And
right.
that's what that's the most that's what I always, when I think about that particular time period, is not who died, although that's very important, but how we took care of those people until they died.
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely right. And your boys show so much, once again, humanity. And so they sort of back into the hospice business almost.
Hmm.
It's basically by accident. But I think that, when you see a need and you have the ability to help meet that need, what a beautiful thing in life that is.
Right, right. I totally agree. And if I'm going to have these guys with a large amount of money, who have a great deal of fame, I want to make sure that they do something with it to give back to the community.
Yes.
And so that was very important. And that story took a long time. That took like almost 6 months to write.
And it shows. I mean, it shows in the
Thank you.
fact that it's so well done. And I think also that we do have an opportunity to share stories, but we always have to, all of us have to be careful. Do we get into preaching territory, or do we get into sharing territory? What you've done,
Right.
you've shared the lives of these two fellows, and you haven't used your authorial voice to be a preacher or to chastise or to say it could have been better, but simply to share these guys' stories. So that was so much fun. So I'm glad you named it Mercedes General and not the Dead book, because I just I'm afraid because I also know that you write horror, so I would be afraid that maybe people would put that in the horror genre. If you had to categorize this, what would you categorize it as?
That's a really good question. And to tell you the truth, at this point, having had several people tell me it's not a book of linked short stories, it's a novel.
I agree.
Um, I'm not sure that I know anything about terminology now.
Well, I'm not sure I do either, Jerry, because in a lot of ways I find it to be an enormous love story. I mean,
You
it's
know,
it's it's not a
that
love
it
story in the rom-com situation at all. It is a love story in a novel form. I think that's a great way to think of it. It really is so wonderful.
well, and I liked the fact that it's over 40 years, and it kind of carries its own sense of history with it.
Yep, yep. And I also think that you bring up some things that, some couples have an open relationship, some couples have a monogamous relationship. And what you did is you showed us the spectrum of relationships without them judging each other. They may not always be comfortable with someone else, but
Right.
yet they're willing to accept and to learn. And I think that was yet another beautiful thing you brought out.
Well, and when I that really comes from a couple of men that I knew, um, at one point in Denver. I was at I was living in a trailer park, a retirement community,
Okay.
and I was like the youngest person in there. I'd been actually in the trailer park long enough so that I was there before it was a retirement community, and all the old people moved in around
Okay.
me. Well, the couple that lived next door to me was a gay male couple, and they had been together for, at that point, like 40, 50 years. And in some respects, Kent and Spencer might be Bob and Earl, but in a lot of respects, no. But Bob, I when I was curious about their relationship, and I'm like, so is it just you guys, or have you guys, had other? Has it been a threesome? Has it just been you guys? Do you guys? Because I know that they trick. That's such an old term, right? Trick.
Right, right. But I knew the term.
I do too. Um, and he's like, I said, so do you have an open relationship? He's like, like it's been open, it's been closed, it's been open with differences. He's like, it's been so many things. He's like, no, we just don't care.
Right. And I think that, I think some people find their partner, and then society likes to put some restrictions on partnership. I think some people
Right.
simply find their partner, and ever how they make it work, they make it work. And I think that's so much less pressure than trying to live under the guidelines that society says we're supposed to live under. That will crush anyone, I think.
Well, that's trying to kind of what I was going for in the last story.
Yes.
Because you see some different varieties of relationship. You see some that are stable, some that are not so stable, some that appear not stable, but that's
That's
that's to other people.
That's right. That's us looking in, assuming we know what they're like. And,
Right.
I often say to people, unless you sleep in the same bed with somebody, you rarely have an idea of exactly what goes on in the couple's relationship.
That's true. That's very true.
So on that truism, because he's a poet, right? So anyway, the book is Mercedes General. It's by Jerry Wheeler, and it is so delicious and highly recommended. Jerry, thank you so much for being with me today. Do you have a website or a social media you'd like to share?
I have a couple websites actually. One of them is called Write, WRITE, and Shine. You could go ahead. It's a WordPress blog.
Lovely.
And then I also run a queer book review site called Out in Print. That is also a WordPress site. Just go ahead and Google those, and
Perfect.
I'll come up first hit.
Lovely. And
And
I'll add them to
I'm on Facebook, Jerry Wheeler. I'm on Instagram, JWDen. I'm all over the place.
fantastic. I'll put those in the show notes so people will have access to you. Thank you,
Yes,
Jerry,
great.
for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate talking to you, and I'm so glad you enjoyed the book. And thanks a lot. I really appreciate
Perfect. Let's do it again sometime soon.
it. Okay, next book.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.